Hello again, and welcome to my next lecture, which is going to be on so-called absolutism. If you follow the syllabus, that's the next topic on our agenda. Let me link what we're going to do today with what we discussed last time. Remember, last time we talked about so-called Protestant Reformation. We also mentioned that for us, Reformation was important, not simply a topic that was related to the history of religion, to the split in the world of Christianity. Remember, Europe was divided in two parts. Northern part became Protestant. South and southwestern part remained Catholic. Martin Luther, 1517, raised the part of Europe, Northern Europe, in revolt against the Roman popes, because he was concerned that there was not much spirituality in the Catholic Church. So Martin Luther wanted to make Christians more spiritual, but indirectly by doing something that in his mind made people more spiritual, he actually contributed to the secularization of Europeans. And remember, we particularly stress two aspects. The first, as a result of Reformation, the Protestant world, the Northern European countries, became obsessed with the Bible. Bible was at the center of their religious world, spiritual world. People started to read like crazy. Men, women, children, everybody learned how to read, and eventually the northern part of Europe became more educated. In response, Catholics also tried to revitalize the doctrines of Roman Catholicism, and we have Jesuits come into the picture who set up Catholic schools, Jesuit schools, to raise children in the spirit of Catholicism. We also have Jesuit universities. Again, to make a long story short, in the Catholic world also became more educated. Not as educated as the world of Protestants, but still, overall, Europeans became more educated. We have more books published. We have the culture of printing became very popular. That's what contributed to the rise of the modern world. Okay, we also have the Bibles being printed and people debating the Bible. We have Protestants arguing about the Bible. A lot of opinions, a lot of denominations, Protestant denominations, spread all over Northern Europe. Okay, and each one came up with its own interpretation of the Bible. People argued about the Bible. So eventually, out of this individual readings of the Bible, individual interpretation of the Bible, we have the rise of what? A critical thinking. Critical thinking. The overall result. We also have in the Protestant movement, especially among those people who followed John Calvin, remember predestination, a powerful religious drive to do what? To work hard, because many followers of John Calvin, remember, in France they were called Huguenots, in England they were called Puritans, followers of John Calvin. They argued that we should be concerned about what? Showing off how good we are, 24/7, no matter what you're doing, praying, selling bread or baking bread, making shoes or going to church. So make sure that you are good in what you're doing. When you do something, make sure that people around you are treated rightly, because God is watching you. So if you slide down, he might change his mind. He might not include you into the group of so-called the elect. Remember, the major message of predestination was that people cannot decide on their own if they're going to be saved. Neither going to church, like in the Catholic Church, no, by only reading the Bible you will be saved, argued followers of John Calvin. But only if you entrust God, okay, if you only have faith. Bible is okay, you need to read the Bible, of course, it's the Word of God. Remember, the major message of Reformation was put emphasis not on the church, not on the Roman Pope, but on the Bible. But still, the other Protestants who were more militant, more radical, they argued that it should be faith by itself. And that's what John Calvin argued. So predestination, only God knows who is going to be saved, who is going to be damned. But what can you do in this case? So you only have one option. Try as much as you can. Maybe you will be included into this group of the elect. Okay, designated for the salvation. Nobody knows for sure. Anyway, since we have so many interpretations, people started to fight among each other. Plus, we have this fight between two big groups of Christians in Europe, Catholics and Protestants, who are killing each other. Thousands of people died, especially in Central Europe, where Catholics and Protestants were openly fighting each other, killing each other over religion. Okay, so what I'm trying to say that we have Catholic and Protestant Europe fighting each other, and we have a lot of people dying. A lot of people dying as a result of these conflicts. And by the middle of the 1600s, we have a tremendous craving for law and order among the people of Europe. There was so much destruction. There was so much crisis. People, again, were upset that we are fighting about religion. How come? What happened? And a lot of so-called common folks, especially redneck folks who had no education, peasants, they interpreted this conflict, what was going on. Some 80% of people couldn't understand what this fight was all about between Catholics and Protestants. Some of them thought that the great Satan somehow came to pitch Christians against Christians, that Satan's agents lived among us. That's what they believe. So what's going on? And there was much stress during Reformation, after Reformation. Even though peace was concluded between Protestants and Catholics 1555 in the German town of Augsburg, still not much was done to relieve the stress. And in some local areas, like in France, for instance, there were still religious wars. People were still killing each other over religion. Okay. So what we have, and what I didn't mention last time too much, okay, we have, as a result of the stress, frustration, we have witch hunts. We have suddenly, in Central Europe especially, a movement, this crazy movement, on the rise, when people became obsessed with witch hunting. So they were looking around for witches, trying to execute witches. Okay, so basically, it was a psychological reaction on the part of the ignorant people, peasants, so-called common people, to what had happened in Europe, especially in the spiritual life. People believed that the great Satan came to screw them up, and he sent the agents, and in this case, they talked about witches that live among people and screw up people somehow. And that is why we need to hunt, to look for these witches. We have to execute them somehow. And nobody knows them. They're hiding each other. They have certain marks on their skins, so we have to identify them. Or a special book was published in Europe. It was called The Hammer of the Witches. It's kind of a book of guidelines how to identify witches among the people. Okay, and the grassroots folks were feeding on each other. It's like even in our days, when we consider ourselves educated people, we still believe in conspiracy theories left and right. People created certain stories. They put their stories, some even made up story in the Facebook. Another person picks it up, and eventually we have thousands of clicks, and then it goes to Twitter, and soon we know that some politicians are kind of declared the incarnation of devils. They did something which in reality they didn't do, or didn't do it on a such grand scale as we try to ascribe to them. So people are prone, no matter, even in our age, so post-modern age of 21st century, people are prone to this conspiracy theories. And now put yourself in the shoes of people at that time. You have this mass epidemic of witch hunting. When, I repeat, a reason people started doing it because of the stress. They couldn't explain why we're fighting each other over religion. And again, they needed scapegoats. So so-called quote-unquote witches became the scapegoats. Okay, who were these witches, quote-unquote? Primarily unmarried women or some males occasionally. 75% of people who were persecuted and executed. The total number of people, again, it's anecdotal evidence, but about 100,000 people were executed in Europe as witches since the early 1600s until 1718. The last witch was executed in Germany, in southern Germany, in 1718. So between these the dates, roughly, again, it's approximate years, approximate numbers, like from early 1600s to early 1700s, we have about 100,000 people being executed as quote-unquote witches. Okay, 75% of them were mostly women, single women, unmarried, because there was nobody to protect them. They were most vulnerable. And males also, males, old males, single old males also were chosen as scapegoats. Basically, it's scapegoating, like, in crowds. Crowds are very dangerous, when you have people in crowd. Like, if somebody goes somewhere to demonstrate something, it's easily can end up in going around beating people, because especially if somebody says, oh, this is the evil person, or this is the evil place, the people who individually will not do something, but in crowd, they're easy for them to commit crimes, because people turn in the packs of animals when they wander around in crowds. The same thing about these redneck peasants in late Middle Ages, early modern times, when they were attacking these innocent women and men, stoning them, killing them, burning them. Burning of witches were especially popular at that time. In many Central European towns, it was like a part of entertainment for women, men, and children who were coming to like a central plaza to watch how witches were executed. So it was like a weird way, from our viewpoint, to have fun. Okay, unfortunately. So this horrible stress. And by the way, jumping ahead, I want to mention that this epidemic, this craze, mass craze, started suddenly, and it died out. It died out on its own by the early 1700s. So it was like explosion. And again, to the present day, we have these explosions of mass violence, mass kind of craziness about something, which people kind of make up stories about something and believe in them. And they said, oh, we're persecuted. We need to destroy those people who persecutes you. Who are these people? So they're making up stories again. Throughout the history, we have hundreds of these incidents. Okay, so witch hunting, it's not something strange. I repeat, it's like a horrible thing, but naturally happened in the wake of this horrible thing that was going on in Europe when people were killing each other over religion. Look at the last bullet point. I colored in red color. Okay, it says people crave for order and stability. So now, as a result of the Reformation and all this craze, witch hunt craze, there was an aspiration, there was a craving for law and order. So let's establish order. So we were fighting so much each other. So we need to somehow to correct the situation. It was a natural drive. Okay? Nobody was sitting like on the top of the pyramid saying, hey, I want to bring up law and order. No, it was just a feeling, conviction on the collective mind, of the people was moving there. And who were these people who came to bring law and order? So these were kings and queens of Europe, which earlier had no power. Remember, I said Europe was heavily decentralized area. Maybe on the globe, maybe in Japan, they had the similar type of society where local lords enjoyed all the power. Okay, local lords. Such people like kings and queens did exist, but they didn't have power, total power. Okay, now in the 1600s, we have these powerful lords who started calling themselves kings and queens, who did come to enjoy more power, and they were supported by people in this case. Okay, so people on the ground, peasants, primarily peasants, and some residents of towns, they came to trust the kings and queens, or powerful lords who said we're going to become kings and queens. They trusted them to bring law and order. And the major stumbling block on the way to this law and order were these feudal lords who lived in, remember, whose ancestors had lived in castles and who enjoyed this luxurious lifestyle, who were fighters, okay, and who had exploited peasants as serfs. So peasants worked for them. Okay, so living in a castle, that's the image of this lord. These type of people were almost gone by the 1600s. Why? Because first we have the invention of gunpowder and guns and cannons, which made all castles obsolete. Okay, and second, we don't have serfs anymore in Western Europe, at least, and in parts of Central Europe, because of different circumstances. We talked about them: epidemic of plague, disarray, and entire decentralization of Europe did not contribute to this enslavement, putting peasants in bondage. Did not contribute to putting peasants in bondage. Okay, so in the wake of the Reformation, in the wake of all these fights, people were asking kings and queens to come and to establish law and order. Okay, so we have this world, decentralized world of local lords dying. We have a grand assault on feudalism. Remember, feudalism, it's a system when power belonged to local lords. So now kings and queens of Europe come to undermine the power of local lords. Okay, we have rise of strong centralized states that wanted to control people, tax people. Okay, especially they wanted to control nobles and church people, and so-called grassroots people of towns and town residents and peasants. They sided with kings and queens. Okay. Mercantilism was on the rise. Mercantilism, it's a desire on the part of kings and queens to store the wealth. These chunks of gold and silver should be accumulated, stored. We need to make sure that we trade, and the trade balance is favorable in our favor. Okay, we should sell more goods than buy, because in this case it makes us powerful. Mercantilism, it's called mercantilism. Since the life in some parts of Europe, kings and queens came to power and joined the popular support. I repeat, peasants and towns especially supported them because they wanted law and order. And a lot of merchants came to support. Again, merchants, craftsmen, people who lived in towns. Towns were especially important for the rise of kings and queens because a lot of people who lived in towns, they were interested in trade. But since under feudalism, all lords were fighting each other, it was unsafe, especially during these wars, religious wars. It was especially unsafe to trade. And now, at least in parts of Europe, we have kings and queens who did bring the stable life. So merchants could safely go around and trade. Okay. And plus, kings and queens also liberated peasants. Liberated, of course, quote unquote. Again, they wanted to make sure that peasants would work for them, for kings and queens, okay? Paying taxes directly to the state instead of lords, okay? So peasants were, in many parts of Western Europe, peasants stopped being serfs, and kings and queens supported this trend. I'm going to use one country, France, to describe to you how absolutism So what we're talking about right now became known as the age of absolutism. Okay, the rise of power, kings and queens. It's so-called the age of absolutism. It's 1600s primarily and the 1700s, but primarily 1600s. That's when we have the power, kings and queens on the rise. Okay, I'm going to use France as an example of absolutism. Okay, in fact, French King Louis XIV was presented at that time in the 1600s as the role model for all monarchs of Europe how to behave. Okay, I'm going to quote him, and you can see the quote, which describes well the essence of absolutism. Look at this quote. He said, "I am the state." Okay, so not you, lords, not anybody else, but I am the state. I'm a monarch. I have the, not the church, although they were religious people, again, don't get me wrong, they were still very religious people, but they slightly changed the balance of power. Okay, and I'm going to tell you in a few moments about it. So they said, after Louis XIV, all monarchs of Europe, in England and Sweden, in parts of Germany. Remember, Germany was still heavily decentralized country, but each king and queen of Europe wanted to say the same thing, and they worked to make sure that it was this way. I am the state. He built, Louis XIV built a luxurious palace in suburbs of Paris. He built in a satellite town called Versailles. He built a royal palace just to show off how great he was, to separate himself from regular lords. I am the great because I am the king, I am the state, remember? And another very important thing, before I tell you this, a very important thing, and this very important thing, by the way, is the last bullet point on this slide. But before I address this last bullet point on your slide, I want to tell you something else. Louis XIV, he wanted also to introduce universal money, universal system of weights and measures to make sure that his country is not decentralized anymore, not a patchwork, not a quilt, but a united country under his guidance. That was his perception. So in order to do this, he introduced universal taxes in France. He also decided to coin money, the same money, you know. I'm not going to deal with this local monetary systems. I'm going to phase it out. And also we're going to sell and buy goods based on universal weights and measures. See, it's very, very important. And the last point, last but not least, right? Louis XIV, and by the way, many other kings and queens of Europe, they started to declare so-called divine rule. Interesting trend. Divine rule of the kings and queens. What does it mean? Remember, we talked before how there was a tug of war between the Roman Catholic Church, it's before the Reformation, and local lords, when each side wanted to be supreme, and they kind of kept this precarious balance. Okay, when the church wanted to appoint local leaders, not local leaders, local church people, abbots, priests, bishops. At the same time, local lords wanted to do this, so there was a tug of war. They were quarreling with each other. And remember, then the Reformation happened when the power of the Roman popes was heavily undermined. Roman popes were not as powerful as they had been before the Reformation. Now the world of Christianity was split in two big factions, and plus this Protestant faction itself was separated in hundreds of different denominations that quarreled with each other. So the former power of the Christian church overall was gone. Under these circumstances, we have kings and queens coming and filling this spiritual void. For example, I will give you an example, the best way to understand what I'm talking about here. Louis XIV introduced this tradition, and that's how people started to view him, to show up in front of the people, in front of the palace for visiting people, to touch his vestments, to touch his robe, maybe to touch his shoes, to touch his food. There was a perception among the people that the spiritual power of the powerful king could heal them from tuberculosis or whatever disease they could have. See, that's the powerful perception which we have now growing, becoming popular, which had not existed before. See, before a lord had not healed people, okay? There were priests, bishops, there was a Roman Pope. Again, to touch the vestment of a bishop, to touch the vestment of course, Roman Pope, that was the thing to do. That's what people had believed in olden days would heal them. Not anymore. Now it was the figure of a king. In this particular case, Louis XIV came to fill this niche because the power of the church was undermined, the spiritual power. See, so now we have so-called king healers. That's how he was nicknamed, by the way, Louis XIV. He received this nickname, King Healer, because he showed up in front of the people to be touched by common folk who believed they could be treated from any disease because they touched this vestment of the king. So now he took over at least part of the spiritual power of the church. It's very important. Plus, he said, my power comes not from the people. See, that was that had been the perception in Middle Ages, when people had believed that local leaders, lords, they just lords, you know. They had no spiritual power. Now, Louis XIV and other kings and queens of Europe, they started to argue that our power comes from heaven, from God. That's what I call the divine power. So they started to claim, kings and queens of Europe in the 1600s, the divine power. See, that's very important. They started to heal people, and they started to claim the divine power. So you cannot dismiss me because my power comes from God. I have the absolute power because I do have absolute power because my power comes from God. See, that was the message they wanted to send to other people. Okay. So the greatest danger came from lords, remember, who lived in their estates and who were not happy about the centralization. Okay. And as I said, Louis XIV introduced the same taxes, standard measures, money, and weights. At the same time, and it could be a bad thing, and I'll explain to you why, these kings and queens wanted to impose the same religion. So since Louis XIV was a Catholic, he wanted to make sure that the entire country would be Catholic. So he renewed attacks against Huguenots. Remember, we talked about the fight between Huguenots. If you forgot who Huguenots were, these were French Protestants who followed John Calvin. Remember, in Britain, in England, they were called Puritans. In France, they were called Huguenots. So he tried to force Huguenots to convert to Catholicism, which upset them very much. There were fights between Huguenots and Catholics. And eventually, about 30,000 Huguenots escaped from France. They moved to Netherlands, to England. And these were the most enterprising people, remember? Because by religion, Protestants were very enterprising people. I explained to you why. Plus, he, of course, didn't like Judaism because he wanted everybody to become Catholic, and which led to the expulsion of Jews from France. And the Jews also escaped to Netherlands and England. Again, like Huguenots, Jews were very enterprising people involved in the commerce. So At that time, of course, nobody in France knew about this, but historically, in a long-term perspective, France did lose the most enterprising element. It's very important. And England and Netherlands acquired this large, not huge, but a large segment of people, Jews and Huguenots, who were the most enterprising element in France. Okay, but anyway, Louis XIV did establish this tradition, how a real king or a queen should behave. Okay, so other kings and queens of Europe tried to copy him. I used to mention other kings and queens of Europe. For instance, last year I told my students about how Russian monarchs behaved, how King of Sweden, Charles the second, I think, yeah, how he tried to be the absolute ruler, but I decided not to do it. Just one example is enough, France. And plus, France is treated as the role model in this case, a role model for all other absolute kings and queens. But the picture will not be complete if I don't mention another country where, as a result of this rise of absolutism, we have a different tradition being injected into European civilization or Western civilization. And it happened by chance. To be specific, we have a country where the rise of absolutism, which didn't face too much resistance in other parts of Europe. In this particular country, which I'm going to mention in a minute, absolutism did face resistance. And as a result of this attempt to create absolutism on the part of kings, we have a different tradition emerging. Okay, by chance, everything happened by chance. And the name of this country is England. Okay, by chance, in England we have an interesting tradition when, unlike other parts of Europe, of course you can add Netherlands here, because in Netherlands remained the merchant republic. Remember, we mentioned this, so Netherlands also should be mentioned. But Netherlands was a tiny peanut, like a small country. England was a bigger country, so her role was more important, and she had a bigger empire. So England, where two kings also wanted to establish absolute power, did not succeed in doing this. In fact, they partially succeeded, but they were overridden by another powerful force, which we don't have in other countries of Western and Central Europe. Okay. Let's talk about England. So we have an interesting tradition emerging in England during the 1600s, the tradition of limited monarchy or checks and balances. Checks and balances, the foundation of the modern political system, or Western system of government, which was adopted by some countries, and in other countries we don't have this system, so it would be correct to say the Western tradition. There was a king in England called James I. See his name here. There was another king, Charles I, who wanted to establish an absolute regime in England, just like in other European countries. We want to be like everybody else, like our sisters and brothers, like kings and queens of Europe. What does it mean? It means I don't want to consult with anybody because I am the state. They wanted to exclaim the same. Okay. So Charles I decided to introduce new taxes, to impose new taxes on the people of England. And he didn't want to consult the parliament. Parliament, it was something that had been created in England a long time ago. When? In 1200s. Again, by chance, something was created called parliament. It's like a council of lords that had to be consulted by king when he wanted to make major decisions. So there was a tradition that a king had to consult the parliament if he wanted to raise new taxes. But this particular king, Charles I, ignored the parliament. Okay? In other European countries of Western Europe, nobody cared, There were like, in France, there were something like this, like a States General, like English Parliament, that it had no power at all. In Spain, there was a very elementary, weak, inefficient parliament called Cortes, like the name of Cortes. So it didn't have any power. So when a king and a queen of Spain created this powerful state, so they ignored the parliament. But in England, there was a different tradition. Interesting. By chance, in England, in 1200s, a written document had been developed which actually empowered the parliament, which created tradition of consulting, that kings had to consult. There was no way for him to avoid this. And here we need to talk about so-called Magna Carta, 1245, Magna Carta. Magna Carta was the spark of the parliament system. That is why this document is important for us here. Magna Carta, or in translation from Latin language, it means the Great Charter. The Great Charter. It was something that had been established between kings and lords. In early Middle Ages, when England was conquered by Vikings, Normans, there was a fight, a tug of war between local lords and alien kings who came to conquer England. And eventually these alien kings did subjugate entire England. But lords were revolting against the king, so there was a tug of war. And eventually in 1245, I'm not going into details here, in 1245, when neither side could prevail, eventually lords, feudal lords, and the king, they met each other. And here you can see this picture when English king fought, again the year is 1245, when the king was offered to sign the Great Charter, where he promised to limit his power. So how did he limit his power? He promised not to take over property arbitrarily, not to take property of lords, not to confiscate the property. He promised them to use the trial by jury for lords. Okay. They received the right to bear arms, lords. So the court, the independence, property, lords' properties couldn't be confiscated. Okay, and he had to consult them each time when he had to make an important state measure, to introduce important state measure. He had to consult them. And the Council of Lords was created, okay, to be consulted. It's a very important, okay. What do we have as a result of this agreement? We have the birth of powerful tradition that was lingering on and on and on and survived, even though the parliament didn't have the total power, because ultimately it was the king to call the shots. Still, we had an institution that was lingering on, institution that the king was expected to consult. And now I'm jumping back to 1600s, early 1600s. We have a King Charles I who did not want to consult the parliament when raising taxes. Okay. On top of this, again, all things happen by chance. On top of this, we have a religious fight brewing in England at that time. It so happened that in the parliament we had at that time a bunch of Puritans, Protestants, okay, followers of John Calvin. What did they want? They revolted against the Anglican Church or English Church. Why? Because Anglican Church was a conservative Protestant church. Remember how it had been created by King Henry VIII? I mentioned last time when I discussed the Reformation, when English King Henry VIII wanted to jump on the bandwagon of the Reformation, and he said, "Oh, I'm with Martin Luther, I'm joining the Reformation." Why? Because I'm in charge of my own church right now. I'm in charge of my own church, and I'm going to appoint the bishops. Okay, it wouldn't be the Roman Pope, and of course, the bishop he appointed, Henry VIII, immediately granted him a divorce. So anyway, hardly any changes had been made in English Church, Anglican Church, and that is why we have Puritans who were sitting in the parliament, who wanted to purify the Anglican Church. Okay, hence the name Puritans, and they were fighting against Anglican Church. But worse still, Charles I sympathized with Catholicism. Okay, Charles I sympathized with Catholicism, which upset people very much, and Parliament revolted against the king. Okay, they said, not only you refuse to consult us about taxes, but plus you harbor hidden Catholic aspirations. So there was a war between Charles I, he had his own army, and the Parliament had his own army. The person who was in charge of the Parliament army was a die-hard Puritan follower of John Calvin named Oliver Cromwell. Okay, and Charles I, again, a Catholic sympathizer. So there was a fight. As a result of this fight, the army of Charles I was defeated. He was himself abducted and beheaded by the Parliament, which horrified all kings and queens of Europe. Okay, but it's very important what the English people did. Why is it important? Because by beheading Charles I, they wanted, I'm not arguing they wanted, but doing it, they already sent the message. Okay, by the act of beheading, they sent a message that royal power is not divine. See, you are not divine. You are a bad manager. You are not a good manager. You don't manage your country. You need to penalize. You need to be penalized. Okay, so they kind of desacralized. Okay, they removed this divine power Charles I wanted to claim, to imitate like his sisters and brothers all over your sisters and brothers, I mean kings and queens. Okay, so they destroyed, the Parliament destroyed this divine aura of the royal power. That's very important. Okay, and then on top of this, the monarchy itself was abolished. So there was no monarchy. So Parliament took over, and they didn't know what to do. So eventually they decided to introduce a republic, parliamentary republic. And again, Oliver Cromwell was put in charge of the country. And in fact, he ruled like a dictator. But look at his title. His formal title was the Lord Protector. See, he was not declared a king because he was not a royal lineage. But at the same time, he was to protect the power of the Parliament. Okay. Hence, the Lord Protector. And that's what eventually we have in England. A famous philosopher, next week I'm going to mention his name, but at this point, just for your information, a major philosopher, European philosopher of the government, John Locke, argued that's what we created as a result of this. The law is more important than the king. Okay, God is up above, but in old absolutism, state. Before it was the king, so God supposedly gives him power, divine power, but English revolt 1640 eliminated this part. See, this part was eliminated, and instead this tradition started to develop, constitutional tradition of the constitutional government. So it's not the king, but the law granted us by God. That's what should be the law of the land, not the king, not the divine power. Okay, so as I said, there was a fight, like a civil war. See, this map shows you there was a even particular area of England that was controlled by the parliament, and other areas were controlled by the royalists, so people who supported the king. Okay, but Oliver Cromwell was the dictator. Okay, and he cracked down not only on Catholics, but he also cracked down on Anglicans, so these conservative Protestants. You know, he harassed them. Some of them were thrown into prison. Some of their properties were confiscated. So, and being a dictator, he not always consulted the parliament. So there was also a sense of frustration on the part of the parliament. They said, "Oh, well, we did a good job. We removed this absolute king, but now we have the dictator who promised to respect our opinion, but he rules as the dictator." But fortunately, Oliver Cromwell died of natural death, and the son of Charles I was brought to power. Charles II, the son of Charles I, was brought to power. Okay, Parliament itself restored the monarchy. Why, you might ask me, why did they do it? That's what they got used to do, because they were not familiar with any other way of doing government, because they knew only with two ways of government: either the king or queen rules everything, or local lords. Okay, they were not, again, they did have a parliamentary republic, but they were not experienced in this. You know, they were not used to this. It's like, remember, George Bush wanted to topple down Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and he believed that immediately when the dictator Saddam Hussein would have been toppled down, Iraq would become a democracy. Of course, it didn't happen because people were not experienced in the institutions of democracy. The dictatorship, that's what they got used to. There's a strong man, and that is why Iraq immediately fell apart into this bunch of chunks of country controlled by these strong warlords. Okay, people should be introduced to the rule of law. Okay, plus they thought that if Charles II would receive power from the hands of the parliament, he would be obedient. But of course, he did not become obedient. Plus, on top of this, he became a Catholic sympathizer. Again, big mistake. Yeah. Stepping on the same rakes again and again. Fortunately, Charles II dies, and his brother James II steps in. Okay. Unfortunately for the parliament, again, King James II was open and devout Catholic, but the parliament, remember, were Puritans. Well, majority of them were Puritans, like let's say 70% Puritans. The rest of them were Anglicans. Catholics were forbidden, so there was actually discrimination against Catholics. So good Christians were not to be Catholics in England at that time. But James II was a secret sympathizer. Open and devout sympathizer. Okay, his deceased brother Charles II was a secret sympathizer. James II was an open sympathizer. Okay, on top of this, he had a Catholic wife who was for a while the parliament wasn't worried because he didn't have a male successor. Okay, he only had a daughter, Mary, who was married to a Protestant prince of William of Orange in Netherlands. William of Orange, he was a Protestant follower of John Calvin who ruled the Netherlands. Okay, he was married to Mary, who was the daughter of James II. Okay, so the Parliament people were not too worried, but suddenly his wife of James II, gave birth to a son, and the son was Catholic, declared Catholic. Okay, baptized as Catholic. So that is why there was a fear, and the Parliament immediately revolted after the birth of son. Okay, the Parliament revolted. The year, very important year, 1688. 1688. Okay. The Parliament was afraid that another Catholic king would be in power. Okay, and the rights would be diminished. Not only political rights, but spiritual rights. Okay. So they quickly mobilized themselves, and they go to Netherlands, representatives of Parliament, and they asked William Orange to invade England, invade us, and he did. He gathered army, and with his Protestant wife, he comes, the daughter of James II, he comes to England and conquers England. So the Parliament opened the gates of England to him. Please have us, conquer us. And seeing these things, James II became scared, and he escapes to France. So he immediately escaped. And now William and Mary come, and they take over as the king and queen. But look, the Parliament wanted to make sure they wouldn't be absolute rulers. So what they did in the Parliament, they forced them to sign an agreement. Not agreement. They forced them to sign a document to guarantee from then on and forever the rights of the English lords, aristocrats, and townspeople. Again, the common farmers, peasants were not considered citizens at that time. Okay, we're talking about townspeople and lords, aristocrats. So these people made them, William and Mary, to sign the Bill of Rights, 1688. In 1689, it becomes the law, Bill of Rights. That is why I highlighted it in red, because the English Bill of Rights is the first constitution. Again, don't mix it with the American Bill of Rights, which, by the way, American Bill of Rights went further, giving people more rights. Okay, but American Bill of Rights was the second after the English Bill of Rights. Okay. English Bill of Rights, again, legalized what vaguely was guaranteed to aristocrats and townspeople, like the trial by jury, no arbitrary confiscation of property. Okay, then freedom, toleration of religions, except the Bill of Rights, except Catholic religion, allowed all other denominations to freely preach and work in England, because Catholics were enemies. Okay, so that was the perception. See, American Bill of Rights did not exclude Catholics, so it was more it was more inclusive. Pardon my current jargon. Okay, so the American Bill of Rights, which was developed later, in the 1700s, went further. But we need to recognize the historical significance of Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights, 1688. Why? Because it's the first constitution, first modern constitution. And the most important stipulation in this Bill of Rights was that the king or queen had to consult the Parliament, and all laws had to be signed by the Parliament and by the king. Okay, there was no way for a king to be absolute right now. So the power should be shared between the Parliament and the king. So what do we have here? We have the introduction of the system of checks and balances. Checks and balances. On top of this, there was the system of courts created. Okay, independent courts. That courts had to be independent from the Parliament and from the king. They had to judge people independently. So we have three sources of power: judicial, executive, the king, and legislative, the Parliament. Again, one more time, we have the checks and balances. So three sources of power that balanced each other: executive, the king; legislative, the Parliament; and judicial, the court system, English court system. See, for the first time we have this constitutional government, although formally it was a limited monarchy. Okay, formally it was limited monarchy because the king still was the head of the state. Very important. That was the historical significance of the Bill of Rights, and in fact it became known as so-called the Glorious Revolution. So it was the first political revolution of modern times. We're going in this course to talk about few other revolutions. In this course we're going to discuss later the American Revolution, 1776. Then we're going to discuss so-called the French Revolution, 1789. But think about these three revolutions together. Okay, these are so-called the modern political revolutions that open the doors to the modern society. Okay, that destroy the old feudal world. Okay, that gave rights to the middle class people and partially to some lower class people. We have the Glorious Revolution of England, 1688, American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution, 1789. And by the way, each of these revolutions pushed society further, granting people more and more freedoms. Okay, I will explain to you what it means. What was the result of the English Glorious Revolution, 1688? As a result of this Bill of Rights or the Glorious Revolution, we have at least, let's say, 4% of the English population becoming citizens. It means they receive the right to elect and be elected, to testify in courts, and the word would be counted in the courts. So they had rights. They had rights. For only 4% of the population. Okay, aristocrats, lords, and the rich townspeople. And by the way, that is why we have in the English Parliament two branches been created to reflect interests of these two classes of people, rich townspeople and aristocrats, lords. Remember, to the present day we have, of course right now they mean different things, but still formally to the present day we have in English Parliament the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So originally they had been, first one was for the Lords and the second one for the Commons, for rich people, well-to-do people from towns. Okay, only 4% of the population who had rights, who became citizens. But jumping ahead, then American Revolution happened 1776, and we already have a little bit more people, like let's say 20% of the population. Okay, all people who had property became citizens. Primarily white males. Women were excluded. Slaves were excluded. Native Americans, about 20%. See, more than in England. And then we have French Revolution, where not only people, by the way, in the United States, males who didn't have white males who didn't have property, they could not have rights either. Okay, we are talking about having property as a qualification to make you into a citizen. But French Revolution went still further. In 1789, we have 50% of the population being enfranchised, so becoming citizens, all males. So including slaves for a brief while. All males in France and her colonial possessions became citizens, received rights. Okay, only women were still excluded from this. Okay, because it was the old society. So see, that's how it was done. But before the Glorious Revolution, before 1688, nobody was granted rights. Nobody could be citizens. Nobody could limit the royal power. Okay, and by the way, in the rest of the world in 1688, neither lord nor peasant could exercise any power, like in Chinese Empire, Russian Empire. So there were no parliaments with such power like in England. Okay, I repeat, there were no parliaments with such power to limit royal power as in England. So even 4% was a small step forward. Okay, that's what I invite you. That's how I invite you to assess what was accomplished as a result of this Bill of Rights. So it was a small but very important step forward on the way to granting people more and more power. Okay, expanding the pool of citizens, expanding people's rights to make political power, again, I would say, more inclusive. Okay, and so historically more and more groups of people were included in the power, becoming citizens. It didn't happen right away. Again, from a present viewpoint, this 4% was bad, right? A small group of people enjoyed the power, but compared to what other parts of the world had at that time, it was a step forward. That's how I encourage you to view what had happened in England. To summarize, in England in 1688, in the age of absolutism, when in continental Europe we have centralized power, kings and queens on the rise, in England we have interesting compromise been established between the royal power and the parliament. As a result of this compromise, which happened by chance, we have two political powers sharing the power, which I repeat was not the case of continental Europe and the rest of the world, where only people who on the top enjoyed all the privileges and the total power. And that was the significance, historical significance of what happened in England. Again, cast against the rest of the world, we see that what was established in England was historically important. That opened the doors to the constitutional government. Okay. Opened the doors to legality, to the rule of law, which did not exist around the world at that time. On this note, let me finish this conversation, and I encourage you to check your syllabus on a regular basis. Check eCourseware for news and notes on my part, and I will see you next time. Thank you for your attention.